you're live.
Very warm welcome to the London Buddhist Centre. My name is Manjusiha. I'm giving a talk this evening on becoming a Buddhist. So I'm here with Ariane and Tara. That's the tech team. So I don't know if they want to say hello, at least not necessarily coming in front of the camera, but yeah, hello from them. And just very warm welcome to you, yeah, wherever you are. Tuning in, as it were. So I'll say a bit about the format of the evening. Many of you will be familiar with our usual format for these classes. We'll have a short meditation at the start, and I'll say a few words about that. Mainly, it's an evening of me talking, but I do hope to leave some time at the end as well for questions. So I'm sure most, if not all of you, will be familiar with just putting any questions in the chat box next to the screen on YouTube, and yeah, hopefully we can get to at least some of those questions before we finish at 8 o'clock. And what else to say? Well, just be nice to know some of you who are online. I heard that someone is just sort of finishing their chips ready for this. So thank you for doing that. I don't know if there's anyone else saying hello online. I can say hello back as well.
There's a bunch of hellos. There's Aaron from Camberwell.
Hello.
Sarah from Norwich.
Great. Camberwell, South London, fantastic. And Norwich, which is part of my old stomping ground. So great to see you.
Lindsay from Cambridgeshire.
Hello there, Lindsay. Welcome. Thank you for tuning in.
And Paul says hi from Mangala's men's class.
Okay. Good.
Perrin.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I remember you, and very nice to see you, as it were. So, yeah, great.
Alice from Deptford.
Deptford, great. Very, very good. Nice to see you, Alice.
And Julia from Tottenham.
Great, thank you. I'll try not to think about the resumption of the Premier League, although that's in my mind as well. Yep.
Might be butchering this, but Marcia from Southwark.
Marcia.
Kevin, who was finishing his chips.
Great, thank you for doing that, Kevin. I'm glad you could join us.
Sophie from
Haringey, yes, yeah.
Nina, a real regular from New York.
Hello again, Nina. Very glad you could join again. It's great. Yeah.
Sophia from Bath.
Great. Yeah.
Paul from Southsea.
Brilliant. That's great. So yeah, we've got a great geographical spread in London and UK and beyond. So yeah, it's really, really fantastic. Yeah, so glad you could join us. So yeah, I'll say a little bit about the meditation shortly, and we'll sit. Yeah, it will just be a short meditation, I think, this evening. Yeah, as I say, what I'm doing this evening is or continuing this theme that we've had this week of becoming a Buddhist. So they are personal talks about our lives and how we find ourselves sitting here in front of the Buddha in the London Buddhist Centre Shrine Room, and just a bit about I'm going to talk a bit about my life story and how I became a Buddhist. I'm also going to talk about race, and I sort of hesitate to do that because it's a very, very difficult area to go into. Certainly, it's been a part of my life story, and as I say, it's not an easy area to go into, but I do want to touch on that. Well, particularly given all that's going on, so with the Black Lives Matter sort of protests and campaign in the US and also here, all of the sort of debates and questions and things that are going on, I sort of feel like I can't not talk about it at the moment in relation to my life, and also in relation to the Dharma, so in relation to the teachings of the Buddha. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do this evening. Yeah, before I do that, I'll just, as I say, I'll wait just a little while before we start the meditation because others may still be joining us as well. But we'll do a short metta bhavana practice. So that's a meditation of cultivating universal loving kindness for all beings. Yeah, just to say something about that. Well, with the metta bhavana, I mean, it's an incredible practice. It really is an incredible practice, and I feel like it's a practice that really can take us all the way to enlightenment. It can take us all the way to the end of the spiritual life and beyond, you could say. I've particularly been thinking about the fourth stage of the meditation practice, the metta bhavana. So one way of talking about that stage is as the enemy stage. When we teach the practice, we often talk about it as being a stage of cultivating well-wishing for someone we're finding difficult. But yeah, we can talk about it as the enemy stage of the practice. When we're setting out with the practice, we say, don't try and put your all-time worst enemy in the fourth stage, because that's just, we're probably biting off more than we can chew, at least when we start the practice. We start learning the practice, if we do that. But I would say that as we practice metta, over a period of time, many years, yeah, I think we can start working with the people that we find most difficult and people who we think of as enemies, maybe. So it just feels like that's always relevant, and it just feels particularly relevant, in the current climate that we live in. It feels like there is a lot of polarization, not just around race, but around so many different issues. We're all under so much pressure, I think, so many of us under a lot of pressure, not least because we are living through very, very difficult time with the pandemic. In London, we're 12 or more weeks into lockdown. It is easing, but it is taking its toll. I mean, I certainly feel the effects of it. So, people are worried about our health, we're worried about our livelihoods. And, in that context, it's very easy for there to be difficulties. It's very difficult, I think, at the moment, communicating with each other, because we are so isolated from each other in so many ways. So I just think it's just such a good opportunity, as we always emphasize here at the London Buddhist Centre, but I think particularly now, to practice metta and really to see whether we can deepen our practice of metta. And as I say, particularly in relation to our enemies. Often enemies, I think it's interesting in terms of politics and the political polarizations that can go on. These things go very, very deep. I think they're, one way of talking about them is, it's like tribal. We're very tribal, I think, with our views about things. And yeah, being able to cultivate fellow feeling in that context is very, very helpful, I think, and very important. It doesn't mean agreeing with other people's views, your enemy's views. That's not what it's about, I don't think. It's about connecting with them as a fellow human being, and seeing that when it comes down to it, we are the same. We're in the same boat. So cultivating solidarity with them, even when you don't agree with them, even when you strongly disagree with them, we can still feel metta for our enemies in that way. And I will say more about that as I go through my talk as well. But yeah, I just wanted to emphasize that before we go into this short meditation. Trying to think if there's anything else I need to say before I start. Maybe that's enough. So what we'll do is we'll just do a 3-stage metta bhavana. So we'll start with ourselves as always. So cultivating well-wishing for ourselves. Then we'll bring to mind a good friend. and connect with the natural feelings of well-wishing we have for our friend. And then we'll expand out the metta and see how far we can take the metta, bringing more and more beings into the field of well-wishing that we've cultivated. And as I say, seeing if you can bring in people you find difficult into that last stage, even your enemies into that last stage. Okay, so let us set ourselves up in our meditation posture. Tara has kindly dimmed the lights in our lovely shrine room here at the Buddhist Center. So doing whatever you need to do just to settle into your posture. However you're sitting, this sense of being relaxed in the posture, but also upright. And when you're ready, closing your eyes. Starting with direct experience of the body. So seeing what sensations you can feel in the body. Sensations of contact. So perhaps contact with the ground. Contact with the support beneath you. Maybe able to feel the contact of your clothes. Just seeing what sensations you can feel in the body. Also just seeing where you're holding on in the body. So often we're holding on habitually. So allowing the belly to be soft. Allowing the face and the hands to be soft. So we go into a short period of metta bhavana practice. So in this first stage, we cultivate metta for ourselves. So this is the natural sense we have of ourselves. We feed ourselves, we clothe ourselves, we take care, naturally take care of ourselves. So just tuning into that perfectly natural sense of well-wishing for yourself. May I be well. May I be free from suffering. and the causes of suffering. And if you find your mind wandering off, then just notice that with a kindly awareness, coming back to the body, perhaps coming back to the heart center inside the chest, coming back to cultivating well-wishing for yourself. And then in the second stage of the practice, we bring to mind a good friend. We bring to mind the natural feelings of well-wishing we have for our good friend. Just like us, they want to be well and happy. So we wish them well. And perhaps we can connect with a sense that our well-wishing for them really does have an effect on them. It has such a positive effect. So we cultivate this well-wishing, loving kindness for our friend. Again, if the mind wanders, we just notice that with kindly awareness. Come back to the sensations in the body, perhaps particularly in the heart center, inside the chest. We bring to mind our good friend and we wish them well. And then in the final stage of this short meditation practice, we bring to mind all beings. So we may bring to mind those in our household, along with our good friend and ourselves. We just see how we can expand the field of our metta to include more and more people more and more beings in this well-wishing. That includes those who we find difficult, those we disagree with, just like us, they want to be well. They want to be happy. They want to avoid suffering. So we wish them well. Seeing how far we can extend the field of our metta, the field of our well-wishing in the direction of all beings. And then we just let go of any effort we've been making in the practice. We just sit still just for a few more moments, just to absorb the effects of the practice. So just a short period of sitting without trying to do anything, without trying not to do anything. And then when you're ready, opening your eyes, coming out of the meditation. Okay, great. So, yeah, I will say welcome if you've joined us during the meditation. I'm very glad you could be with us. My name's Manjusiha. I teach here at the London Buddhist Centre. So, yeah, great, particularly if you're tuning in for the first time to our live streams. Great to see you here. Very glad you can join us. So, yes, this evening is a continuation of a theme we've had all week on becoming a Buddha. That would be great, wouldn't it? Becoming a Buddha. That is the theme, of course. But I'm also going to be talking about becoming a Buddhist as well. That's the purpose of becoming a Buddhist, to become a Buddha. But anyway, so I'm going to be talking about becoming a Buddhist. And yeah, it's going to be, I'm going to talk about my own life story. But also I'm going to talk about race and the Dharma. So race in relation to the teachings of the Buddha. As I understand and as I understand it. I'm going to start by talking about this book, which many of you, if not all of you, will be familiar with, even if it's not in this edition. So this is the Dhammapada. It's a teaching of the Buddha that really goes well back to the life of the Buddha. You know, it's very much the early tradition of Buddhism, very much the word of the Buddha. And as far as I can remember, it's the first Buddhist text that I read. I'm probably not unusual in that at all, actually. It's the first one that many of us come across. I particularly remember being in South America with a particular copy of of the Dhammapada. It was a 60-page copy. It was published by Penguin to celebrate their 60th anniversary. So they had these series of very sort of thin, short books they were publishing, and the Dhammapada was one of them. So this is before I was a Buddhist. This is before I knew I was a Buddhist, at least. But I was, and this was in the year 2000. I found myself in Chile, in the foothills of the Andes. And I was actually in a Buddhist retreat center with a copy of the Dhammapada, but I was not a Buddhist. So I probably should try and say something about how I ended up there. Basically, what I used to do every year, as far as I could, was I was self-employed. I'm still self-employed. I would try and leave the UK during the winter. I particularly try not to be in the UK in February, which, even though it's the shortest month of the year, I still find it the longest month. It just feels like, I've had enough of winter by that stage. The darkness is quite enough. So yeah, I just took to going, particularly to Latin America at that time, and spending 3 months there. And I was also writing. So I'm a writer, and in a way that was the early days of trying to write fiction. So basically, I must have just read about this place in my guidebook, and I trekked out there, and I just asked them, can I stay here and write? And it was run, this particular retreat center was run by a Swiss man, or a Swiss couple. I just mainly knew him. And he was just very, very kind to me. He gave me 2 meals a day. He gave me sort of a reduced rate at this place, even though I wasn't a Buddhist, and I had, that's not what I was sort of asking for. So he was very, very kind. And as I say, I had this copy of the Dhammapada. So where I travelled from was Norfolk. I was early 30s actually at that point. I was living with my parents. Basically, I'd sort of rented out my flat, and I was living back at home in Norfolk. Partly, so my dad was Nigerian, and my mum was English. And we'd moved to Norfolk when I was 9. And during this time, basically, my dad was very ill. He'd had a stroke a few years before that. And basically, my mum was caring for him and for my grandmother at our home in Norfolk. So I was spending time there, and then I was traveling. So that's where I'd come from. I'm going to say, I'll say a bit more about growing up in Norfolk before I return to Chile, if you like. As I say, we'd moved there, and when we moved there, which was actually late 70s, it was quite unusual for a mixed race family to be living in rural Norfolk at that time. Let's just say that. It was just very, very unusual. I remember my dad coming back from work one day, and he was really sort of quite furious, and I didn't often see him like this, and basically someone at work had been racist to him, had called him a racist name, basically. And we'd been in Norfolk for a bit of time by that stage. And I was quite shocked, actually. And what I was shocked by, actually, was that it had taken my dad so long for that to happen to him. I think his shock was partly like he couldn't believe this had happened to him, and my shock was how did it take so long for this to happen? So that was a sort of strange thing, really. I mean, partly it's a generational thing, like going to school in a new place when you're an outsider, when you look different. We just know that as school kids we pick up on those differences. And just to say, I mean, I feel very, very fortunate for the fact that we moved to Norfolk and that was my schooling. I had a very, very happy upbringing, and I just benefited enormously from that. And also there were kids at school who I knew I had to avoid. When I was at middle school, which is basically up to the age of 12, there was one kid who just sort of attacked me, and I sort of defended myself as best I could. And also the previous school, well, basically we'd left the previous town, I think, because of abuse that we'd received from a particular kid who was in my school as well. He beat me up. Another time he threw something through our window. And one of the things, a golf ball landed in our front room one day. And one of the things about this is, some of these things, they're not explicitly racist. There's no racist language in either of those things. But when you grow up with these things, you get to judge where it's coming from. So yeah, that was part of my experience of growing up as well. It was fortunately a small part actually for me, and as I say, I do feel very, very grateful for the conditions I had as well. But yeah, so part of the shock for me was that for my dad, it seemed to be like even rarer. It just seemed not to have happened to him up until that point. I mean, so that was the shock I had. Sort of when he mentioned that particular sort of occasion to me. That's just a sort of little snapshot of my life. Sort of when I arrived in Chile, I meant to read some of the verses from the Dhammapada before the meditation, and what I want to do in the talk as well is just to explore some of these verses in relation to my life story and race. Maybe I'll just mention the first words of the Dhammapada, which are, experiences are preceded by mind. Experiences are preceded by mind. What does that mean in terms of physical violence? What does it mean in terms of racist violence? What does it mean in terms of sexual violence? Or, it's very striking, isn't it? The emphasis in Buddhism, in the Dharma, on the mind. So I want to say, what it's not saying is everything is sort of just created by the mind in a particular way, as though nothing exists. It's also not saying that the consequences, all of the consequences of our actions are to do with our previous actions. That can be one of the understandings, I think. The next part of this verse is, if one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows, even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox. So, one of the misunderstandings of the Dharma is, we experience suffering. All of our suffering comes from our actions. So that's really a misunderstanding of the Dharma, of course. What I think it's saying, this verse, is that, the mind is a prison, can be a prison of our own creating, and it can also be our means of emancipation. So I think that's basically what this verse is saying, that the mind is a great treasure, and we have within ourselves our way of freedom, our means of freedom. I mean, the strongest experience I've had of this is up another mountain. So this was, so I'm going to fast forward 9 years from Chile, my experience of Chile, when I wasn't a Buddhist, and I had a copy of the Dhammapada. Fast forward 9 years, and I'm up another mountain, getting ordained. So I'm making a lifelong commitment in southern Spain to be a Buddhist. And I will say a bit about how I got from Chile to Spain, how I became a Buddhist between those two sort of retreats, you could say. But yeah, when I was in Spain, when I was on my ordination course, I feel like I had the sort of strongest experience of the power of the mind in this sense. So there was a moment when, so I was ordained with 18 other men, and there was also 4 men on the team as well. And there was a moment on that retreat. It was a 4-month retreat up a mountain. There was a moment when I was going towards dinner. I was approaching this open dining area, and this thought popped into my mind, which was just quite an innocuous thought, really. And it was, I wonder what the brothers are thinking of me. That was the entirety of this thought. I wonder what the brothers are thinking of me. And what I realized immediately with that thought was basically how I trap myself with my mind, how so much of the time I'm trying to second guess what other people are thinking about me and what a trap that is. And that partly comes from my conditioning. It partly comes from growing up as, to use this language, a visible minority. So when you're visible like that, I think I was constantly assessing the safety of situations. Whenever I was entering a space that was unusual or new, I was trying to second guess, well, actually, is this safe? Is this a threat? When you can be on the receiving end of violence just for your appearance, then you get very, very skilled at doing that. You get very, very sensitive to assessing that threat. And the reason for that is because, well, your life does depend on it. There are situations where you really need to be sensitive to that. Another example of that from growing up in Norfolk, well, a couple of examples actually. I was on a double date with my older brother. I think this is the only time we went on a double date. It's not something we had a habit of doing. I don't know how we managed to do it on this occasion. And we were in a local town, like a big town compared to where we were living. And we entered this pub we'd never been in before. And we immediately knew that we shouldn't be in that pub, basically. Our dates, I don't think were aware of this. So we were with 2 white women, and it's not to say that this is just a race thing, because what I'm talking about can this sensitivity to threat obviously can be there in terms of gender, it can be there in terms of sexuality, in terms of so many different things. But yeah, so at this, at the moment, I'm talking about the race part of that. So and yeah, so me and my brother immediately knew we were under great threat in that place. And we sat down. I mean, we ordered drinks, amazingly, and we sat down. And before we got through much of our drinks, this skinhead came over to us and basically said, "You have to leave." That's not what he said, actually. It was much, much stronger than that. And we left. Strangely, he was someone I knew from school, which I think partly helped us in that situation. So there was that connection, at least. But yeah, we knew we were under great threat. There's another time going to a party, and these were 2 sisters from school. I knew both of them. One of them, I think, had gone to a different school for some reason, and they decided to have a house party, and they invited people from both schools. And in retrospect, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because often you have these sort of rivalries between, particularly like schools that are close to each other. And yeah, so I was at this party, and I saw these guys come into this sitting room that I was in, and I knew immediately that this was a very, very dangerous situation to be in. Again, it wasn't. They didn't say anything. It was just they were assessing a situation, and I knew they were looking basically for trouble, and I knew that I would be targeted as part of that. So that was my intuition, and again, I managed to sort of leave that that situation, intact through that intuition, through that knowledge, really. So yeah, I don't often talk about this part of my upbringing, actually. And in a way, I don't want to overemphasize it, because I feel like I've just been so lucky and so fortunate with my upbringing and with my life. I love Norfolk. You know, my mum's still there, yeah. But I think I do also want to just talk about that part of my experience, because well, you know, this is a very, very sort of live issue around us as well at the moment. So yeah, yeah. Manjusiha says my glasses light up when I look at my screen, so I'm just going to acknowledge that, and I'm going to look at my screen for my notes about what I want to talk about next. So yeah, just yeah, going back to that moment on my ordination retreat. Yeah, so what I'd done, I think, is internalized that sense of potential threat. And I'd say I'm not alone in doing that. And it's not just a race thing, but I feel if you're a visible minority, you become very attuned to that. And I feel like that's what I was bringing to the table, literally, with my brothers on that retreat. There was no threat from my brothers. You know, it was really beautiful. It was the best time of my life, the most significant moment in my life, getting ordained. But I just basically had a glimpse that, yes, I've internalized this, and this is a way that I'm limiting myself. This is a prison that I've created through the circumstances of my life that is limiting me. It's something that I'm doing. And it's also, at the same time, I got a glimpse of not doing it, a glimpse of the freedom from not limiting myself in that way, not second guessing what other people are thinking about me. You know, there's a name for this. In the States, there was a sociologist called Du Bois, a black sociologist. He died in the 60s. He talked about double consciousness, which is well, this idea of always looking at oneself through others' eyes. So he wrote about that in a book called The Souls of Black Folk, a beautiful book. And so, yeah, I think basically, you know, that's what I was doing, and that's not unusual. You know, if you're a visible minority in that way. But yeah, so I had a taste of freedom from doing that, freedom from limiting myself, and that's in the Buddhist tradition. That's a wisdom reflection. So that's a wisdom reflection. Again, it's not saying that these things don't exist. It's not saying that the violence or the world around us is just of the mind. It's saying that the suffering that we cause ourselves, we can liberate ourselves from that. Yeah. So yeah, the wisdom element. The other side of the wisdom element is compassion. So having compassion for others, having compassion for the way that we all limit ourselves in this way. Yeah. So I just think we have to be quite careful how we apply the teaching sometimes. Well, always, don't we? You know, these are very, very subtle, beautiful teachings. These are freedom teachings. If we apply wisdom teachings to other people, so in a situation, for example, well, I think a classic situation might be when someone is bereaved, you don't talk to them about impermanence necessarily at that moment. Impermanence is the truth. Impermanence is a great thing to reflect on. But if we bring the truth of impermanence to someone who's suffering with loss, then, well, it's to do the opposite of what the teaching actually is saying. So yeah, I think it's very important, this distinction between the wisdom side, which we apply to ourselves. I apply that teaching to myself, and I apply compassion. I apply empathy, I imply solidarity to others. I think that's very, very important distinction to make, actually. Okay. Maybe at the start I said I was quite daunted going into this topic. There's so much to say in this area, and as I say, I do want to leave some space for questions. So where to go next? Maybe I'll take us back to the Dhammapada, and I'll take us to the next couple of verses from the Dhammapada, which again probably many of you are familiar with. Those who entertain such thoughts as "he abused me, he beats me, he conquered me, he robbed me," will not still their hatred. Those who do not entertain such thoughts as "he abused me, he beats me, he conquered me, he robbed me," will still their hatred. So yeah, that's verses 3 and 4 of Dhammapada. I mean, it's very, very strong, I think, isn't it? And again, how do we use those teachings in relation to race? I've heard those teachings used in relation to the Black Lives Matter protesters to say, well, almost like the sort of implication that these protests are wrong because they're fueled by anger or they're fueled by hatred. For me, that's to pick the teaching up at the wrong end and to apply it the wrong way round. I mean, I am also exaggerating, I think, for effect as well, because well, we're motivated by such a mix of things, aren't we, when we act? If we wait until we're completely pure before we act, then, well, we wouldn't be able to do anything. So, I mean, again, I'm exaggerating for effect. So, yeah, for all of us, we'll have a mix of motivations, a mix of drives. What we are trying to do is we're trying to purify those drives. We are trying to eradicate hatred. We are trying to eradicate anger. That's what I'm trying to do. That's what I've committed to doing. I feel like that's what I committed to doing when I became a Buddhist, when I became an order member, certainly. And I have great faith that it's possible to eradicate hatred. At the same time, for most of us, most of the time, including myself, there is a mix of emotions and drives. So yeah, it may take a few lifetimes to eradicate my own hatred. Yeah, I want to be a force for good in the world, and acting from the right motivation, really sort of trying to practice, I think is a way of purification potentially as well. So yeah. And this solidarity that I'm talking about is a two-way thing, isn't it? It's really hard, this topic of race, because I feel like something is really happening in the world, and it's very, very difficult when it's not talked about. It's also very, very difficult to talk about it as well. And part of the difficulty is it can feel like it's a sort of guilt trip or something. Talking about it, part of the purity is trying to not act from guilt in relation to this. It's trying to not act from hatred. Basically trying to be a force for good in the world. Yeah, that applies, as I say, for our enemies as well. I'm going to carry on and read another verse, and then I'm going to say a bit more, and then I'm going to stop. And I hope you can help me by asking me questions as well, which to draw things out. So please do put questions into the chat box. So maybe I'll finish with this verse and a few words about it, and then I'll open up. So, not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. So I'm going to read that again. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. this is the eternal law. So again, what does that mean in terms of race? What does that mean in terms of having been physically abused or verbally abused? How can we cultivate love in that situation? It seems incredibly hard, incredibly difficult. I looked up the Pali word that is translated here, and I don't have it to hand, but what's actually being translated is, instead of love, the word in the original is non-hatred. Non-hatred. Love is I think the root of non-hatred, because if we're feeling love, we're not feeling hate. We can't have both in our minds at the same time. But equally, it could be faith. Any positive emotion will go against hatred. So non-hatred could be faith, it could be courage, it could be so many other positive emotions. Because if we are going to be a positive force in the world, the only way I think we can really do that is if we feel metta for our enemies, if we feel love for our enemies. And part of that is understanding them. One of the other things I was doing up the mountain in Chile, as I was saying, was trying to write. Recently I went on before the lockdown, I went on a seminar with a screenwriter who is very, very good. One of the things he talked about is, how do you write from the point of view of someone you strongly disagree with? The example he gave was during the miners' strike. He was doing a writing workshop, I think, with striking miners, and he asked them to write scenes from the point of view of the people who were not striking. So they were so-called scabs, and the miners refused to do it in that situation. But for me, that's what metta for our enemy is. It's really understanding, well, the story from their point of view. Just like us, they're afraid of being coerced into thinking something, or feeling like they have to speak in a certain way, or they're worried about violence. They're just like us. So I think part of the struggle for racial equality, I think, for me, is empathizing with people we might strongly disagree with from a political point of view, feeling love for them even, because unless we can at least get a taste of that, then we might be contributing to a worse situation. And I'm going to finish, and hopefully there's a bit of time for a few questions. I just want to finish by talking about this man. His name is Patrick Hutchinson. He's a black man. I think he's a personal trainer, and some of you will have seen this image of him carrying a white man away from danger in the race protests that were going on. So the white man was on the ground, as I understand it, and he was in great danger. Patrick Hutchinson and his friends, basically, they ganged together to bring this man out. And for me, that's what Buddhism looks like in this context. I don't know if he's a Buddhist. I suspect he's not a Buddhist. But him and his friends, that's for me what a spiritual community looks like in this context. That's love for the enemy, and also, really making your voice heard for what you believe in. So I'm going to finish there. Clearly, I've bitten off more than I can chew, and I hope you will ask just a few questions before we finish to sort of explore that a bit further. Yeah, so thank you.
We have a first question from Kevin. What are your thoughts on on the fact that Martin Luther King and Gandhi's achievements still happened in the context of violence? Maybe you could repeat the question.
So it's a question from Kevin about Martin Luther King and Gandhi and their achievements being in the context of violence. Well, they're famously non-violent, their approach, famously non-violent. And I really hope that the protests that are happening now are non-violent. I believe they are mostly non-violent. And well, again, I guess I just come back to the Dhammapada. Unless we can pacify our anger and our hatred, we won't bring about change. That does not mean being a doormat. That does not mean, I think metta is not just a nice feeling. You know, metta is a force. Metta is a force for good in the world. Metta is a non-violent force. It doesn't mean agreeing. It doesn't mean a superficial agreement. You know, we can strongly disagree with each other and still have great solidarity, great metta for each other. So for me, that's what non-violence looks like. You know, it's bringing that force for good into the world and having courage, having faith, having so many of the positive qualities, not just falling over and accepting. Yeah. So thanks for the question, Kevin. Yeah. Yeah.
Another one from Rita. What do you think we can cultivate? What's one thing we can cultivate to progress the Black Lives Matter movement?
I think of the great Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in this. I think of his slogan, educate, agitate, organize. And particularly educate for me. So what I've been trying to do is I've been trying to educate myself. So I've talked a little bit about my life story. This session I've sort of gone off into another territory with this session, just touched a bit on my life story. So, you know, it can sound like, well, I know everything about race. I know everything about racial inequality. I don't, you know, I need to educate myself about that. I also feel I need to educate myself about the people who are defending statues, to put it in those terms. I need to understand why that's happening. And I need to find a way of empathizing and finding metta and love for those people, rather than polarizing. You know, I have a lot of respect actually for that happening as well. I think one of my favorite images I've seen is these sort of burly white men defending the statue of George Eliot, the female Victorian novelist. I don't know which town square that was in, but you know, I'm really with that. I think that's fantastic. You know, these are really complex issues. You know, it's not a simple issue. You know, so for me, that's really what I've taken on. I need to try and understand more deeply. I need to try and educate myself more fully. So I think that's a great starting point. Whoever we are, actually, yeah. So thank you for the question. Yeah.
Do you want to take another one? Or?
Yeah, maybe one more, one short one.
Okay,
Yeah,
let's just
yeah.
do this one. Just what does your name mean?
Ah, well, brilliant question. Thank you. So my name, Manjusiha, was given to me by Maitreya Bandhu, who's my private preceptor. He was here just now helping us set up. And it's a great gift. Manju means pleasing or charming or sweet. Siha means lion, lion like the Buddha. So that's my life's work, working out how those two parts of my name, which seem so different and unrelated to each other, how they fit together. And part of the naming is I'm part of the family of the Buddha. Now that's what I've committed to. So there's a going forth from my group and joining, a group that basically includes anyone. Actually, the other part of diversity that I want to emphasize is diversity includes political views. It includes every political view, even if we disagree with it. There must be some, some limits somehow. I mean, if it's a political view that's really, really sort of violent, then obviously, yeah, that's, I don't know how that fits. But in terms of left and right, that's diversity as well, isn't it? So yes, that's what my name means. That's my life's work, for this lifetime at least, and possibly others as well. So thank you for that question, and thank you very much for listening, and for engaging with this topic. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion going on, and I hope this is a helpful contribution to that. And I very much hope it's not the end of the discussion, and I hope we can bring these positive, skillful qualities and the courage and the energy to what's happening, and have a positive impact on what's happening. So in the last minute, what I'm going to do is just going to read the Transference of Merit and Self-Surrender, just to bring this evening, this hour to a close. So I'll just pause for a few moments and then read the Transference of Merit and Self-Surrender. May the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personality throughout my existences, my possessions, and my merit in all three ways, I give up without regard to myself, for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings, situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace. Thank you all, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.